Hey everyone, this is module 12 for this Django course I'm putting together. In this module, we'll be following along from module 11 where we created an e-commerce app. So now we've already got our models, we've got our API manager, we're now going to start creating views and decorators and working with Ajax and things like that. So this is a really good one. I hope you're excited. I am. I'm going to be here following along every step of the way as I always am. So let's jump straight into it. Okay, as always, my browser opens up on GitHub. This is the main repository for the course. So if you haven't been following along, we're using this repository and the step MD files as instructions and follow along, and every step-by-step follow along for the course. Okay, so what you want to do, if you want a link to this repository, then it's in the description below. So whilst you're there, drop me a like, add a comment, subscribe to the channel if you wouldn't mind. So what you want to do is just go over to main on the pull down and just go to branch module 11. Open up steps, can you see that? Yeah, and then find module 12. These are the steps that we'll be following along with today. Essentially, we're creating views and URLs. I don't work with GitHub in these tutorials because it's a bit clunky. Instead, I look at VS Code, so I can render MD files in a preview like this. It look nice and easy to understand. So this follows on from module 11. First thing you should do is just make sure that your repositories, your local root directory matches what's on the screen here, okay? You have to have an e-commerce app with utils because we created the modules, the models, and we created the API manager. You must have that. If you haven't got it and it doesn't match what's on the screen, just pull origin module 12. That should sync everything up. So if you haven't already got the repository, then clone it down and then pull down from module 12, okay? That should give you everything that you need. So, okay, what are we doing? So we are following along from the last module. Let's just put a pin in it there. Make sure that you've CD'd into the development directory, root directory, which is Django course, fire up your virtual environment, and also just fire up a server, okay? It's not going to hurt anyone. Following on from the last module, we've built a database tables, so we've got our models, and we've built an API manager, so we've got an e-commerce manager that works with Stripe. In this module, we'll be creating some views. So the views, we want to mirror what we've done in models. So it's the user story. So we want a user to look at all of the listings that we have in our store. Okay, and then when you click on one listing, it takes them to a detail page, so an individual listing page for that item. Add it to their cart. They fill their cart. They go to a checkout. They make a payment. And then once they've made a payment, they want to see their orders. So a list of all of their orders, and then they can click on an order to drill down and see that particular order that was made on that particular day. Okay, so that's what we want to do. We want to kind of flesh out this e-commerce app to kind of tick the boxes on that user story. And that's what we're going to do. So if you can open up e-commerce/views.py, I'll go back onto GitHub and I'll just click the little copy button because it's a lot easier. And what we're going to do, we'll open up views.py in e-commerce and we'll just paste everything in. We'll start right at the top. And we'll just look at all of the imports and we'll look at the decorators and then the views, okay? So imports, anything different here? No different. We've already got the generic. We've looked at that in core and we looked at that in users. Django has a whole bunch of generic class-based views that we can tap into that do a lot of the heavy lifting, such as add things to context, look for templates. What else does it do? It adds pagination and things like that to list views, things like that. So I try to use generic views as much as I can and then just adapt the methods as necessary rather than using my own class-based views or function-based views. We've already looked at redirect reverse. We're bringing in settings so we can have access to our settings of the project. We've already looked at these decorators. So one's a method decorator that we can use to a class method. And within that, we can add login required. So this says the user must be logged in or authenticated to access this view or URL. We've already looked at that. We have got JSON response in this file. We haven't looked at that before, but we have had HTTP response bad request, I believe. But anyway, these are just some classes that we can use in the project to handle data in a certain way. So JSON response allows us to respond with JSON rather than a HTTP response, okay? Because we are actually going to be calling some of these views today using Ajax, so an asynchronous call with jQuery. Okay, so we haven't done that before. We're going to do that today in today's module, and maybe some is going to roll over to tomorrow's module or the next module. Okay, bringing in all of our models, bringing in our API manager, our e-commerce manager there. We've got functools. Now that's a Python package that allows us to access wraps because we're creating decorators. Okay, so this is a decorator, some functionality that wraps a class. Okay, and it adds some functionality to methods and things like that. Okay, and then we bring in Stripe, which is a Stripe SDK. We instantiate it with an API key, and then we can call Stripe SDK, such as create customer, create a source, things like that. Okay, so we're using that. I don't actually know if we need that in views, but it's there anyway. We use that in last module for e-commerce manager. Okay, so the first thing we do is we create a couple of decorators. Now the first decorator is one called Ajax required. It's just a decorator. I'm assuming you understand Python, by the way. So this is kind of a Python thing. We are creating a decorator for our views to say that to access this view or make a request to this view, it must be an asynchronous or an Ajax call using jQuery. Okay, and all it does, it just wraps it and says, look, if not. So if we don't have the X request with equals XML HTTP request, then we return invalid request. So that will be, in this instance, an invalid request because we're expecting Ajax. Okay, we don't need to go to the ins and outs of that, but it's a handy little decorator to have. So use it as you like, really. So we've got another one here that I've created called empty cart. So this decorator is for views that checks if a user cart is empty or not. Okay, so and it redirects a user to items. So we want this for checkout, right? So why would we want a user to go to a checkout page if they haven't got items in their cart? So when a user tries to access the URL, which we checkout, this decorator will say, hang on a minute, the user doesn't have any items in this cart, so let's redirect them to the items so they can add some stuff to the cart. That's the idea of this. So we get the user from the request, we get the we instantiate the e-commerce manager. Remember, this is the first example of us actually doing that. So this is the e-commerce manager we made in the last module. We instantiate it with user. That is a argument that you must pass through. So if this is the first time the user has tried to access the checkout or what have you, it will create a wallet, create a cart for that user, and it will then create a Stripe customer and it will save the Stripe ID to the wallet. Okay, so that's what it does in the background. It then gets the cart object. So we're calling e-commerce manager and we're calling cart object. So this now retrieves, it gets or creates the cart for the user. So we now know definitively that this user has got a cart in our database. It checks if the user has any items. So gets everything, does a count on the query set. And if it's equals 0, then we redirect reverse to e-commerce cart. Okay, so rather than going to items, actually, it says it redirects to items. It doesn't actually redirect them to cart. And that doc string needs changing. At one point, they did redirect them to items. But you can change that however you want the user story to be. You change it as you like. This will still work. Okay, so we are redirecting to e-commerce cart. We haven't created that URL yet, but we will. Okay, items. We've got two here. We've got generic list view. So this is all of the items, each and every item in our store. And this is the detail view. This is a detail view, a specific view for a specific item. So a generic dot list view. Got a doc string here. And then we've got the model is item. So you pass through the actual model. That's what you need to do for a generic class-based view or list view. Pass through the model. Tell the class where the template lives. So in this case, it's e-commerce items. We haven't created those yet. Remember, I look at requirements first, so third-party packages. I then look at models. I then look at views, URLs, templates, static files in that order. Okay, so I'll create the templates for these views in a moment. They won't work until we do that. Paginate by. We want to paginate by 10. So this is a list-based view. So if this was a function-based view on my own purpose-built class-based view, I would need to create some pagination logic. Okay, so if it's page 1, I'll show the first 10. Page 2 would be 10 to 20 in this instance. Because this is a list view, that's already built in. You don't need to do any of that functionality. It saves a lot of time and effort. We just need to tell the generic list view how many we want to display on page 1. And then it will do all the pagination for you, okay? And it will add all of that pagination stuff to the context so you can have access to it in your Django template. Okay, then we've got dispatch. We've done this before. To the dispatch method, you add the method decorator and a login required. That will stop anyone who's unauthenticated or they're not authenticated, they can't view or access this viewer URL. And we get the query set. So the query set in this instance is items, objects, we call active. So remember, we're using Django extensions in this project. Django extensions adds a status field to our model. Now, it adds a manager to the model also. So we have access to a method in that manager called active. So if we call items.objects.active, that will filter out any objects that have status equals 0, which is inactive. So we'll only ever return items that are active. So that allows us in the admin page to mark certain items as inactive at will. We can just say, right, these are no longer active. We don't want them displayed. Click it to inactive, save it in the admin page. Users will no longer be able to access that item. We then filter them and we say only display where the stock is greater than, GT greater than 0. So active items that have stock, show them all. Okay, that's what we're trying to do. So that's what we're doing. So the get query set method that the list view uses, so this is how it gets the query set, and it adds the query set to context in the way of object list, I believe. We'll have a look. We'll have a look in the debug panel. So that's it. That's all you need to do. That is a detail view for all of our items. You don't need to do anything more than that. You can get fancy and show some other, add some other filters and what have you, but that is the bare bones. That's all you need to do for a detail view. So a list view. A detail view, similar, you need to post the model, template, decorator to stop people from accessing it if they're not logged in. That's all you need to do. That will now display the item, so the particular item which has a slug that matches that in the URL. Now we'll create the URL in a few moments. We've already got the get absolute URL in our model. Okay, I'll show you when we get to that point. I'll show you what that all means and how it all works. But that's all you need for a detail view. Okay, we've then got add and remove. We'll look at that in a second. Cart view, checkout view. So the cart view is a template view. Okay, so we just tell it the template. So you have to tell it what template to find. We're adding something to context specific to this view, and we need to add the publishable key. The reason we're adding a publishable key to the cart view is that we need, I can't remember if that's a hangover or not, but either way it's in there, but we have the option of adding context to a specific view, so we can access, in this instance it will be a variable called stripe key in context in the Django template. I can't remember if you actually need it. The reason you post the publishable key into the to the front end so you can access it is that you can actually use the Stripe JavaScript to make calls and actually make the Ajax call to the back end. So to do that, you need a publishable key to create the form element and create a token and then send that token to the back end. It all makes sense when we start looking at the JavaScript and the Ajax. Got method decorator with a login required. Again, all of these are login required, right? You can add the login required method decorator to the URLs if you like. It's a little bit easier, but I like to add all of that functionality to my view. For me, that kind of logic needs to sit in a view. That's my personal preference. Checkout, I definitely know that we need the Stripe key in the checkout because it's the checkout where we handle the payment. I don't know why I've got it in cart. That could be a hangover, copy paste job. Okay, so telling it what template to use that we haven't created yet. We're passing through Stripe key. We're also passing through all of the sources. So I want the user to have access, not the ability to use a new payment card for a payment or to use a valid card that you've used before. So when they make up their first payment, their card will be saved to Stripe, and when they have access to it, they can then say, actually, I want to use that card that we used last time. To do that, we need to post the sources that Stripe has in their database to the context. We call the get source data, and if you remember in e-commerce manager, it creates this dictionary of last 4 digits, expiry date, and so on and so forth. And it creates a dictionary that we can help create a table of data in the front end, which we will do when we create the templates. And then simple try and accept. So we look for a default card. So we get the card that is default. If it does not exist, then we do not have a default card. Simple as that. And we post default card to the context. So we're adding a whole bunch of stuff to context, and that allows us to add some logic to the Django template. That'll all make sense in a second or two. Oh, sorry, in one of these modules. Again, method decorator, login required. We had another method decorator, empty cart. So remember, if this user doesn't have anything in their cart, it redirects them. So that's where we're using that decorator. We're actually using the Ajax required here, so add or remove item. We'll come back to that. Checkout, Stripe payment, update source. We'll look at those in a second. We've got the order view, exactly the same as the list, item view. It's a list view. So we're adding the method decorator to dispatch, so only authenticated users can access it. And we've got a get query set. So we're actually telling the list view what the query set should be. So only active line objects, and we filter the line objects by user. Okay, so we're not bringing back the invoice, we're bringing back all the lines, individual lines, which are the individual orders, right? So one invoice can have multiple lines, so we're bringing back the lines, not the invoice. And then the detail view, again, will be the line model, and the get object method, which is the individual method, would be where the line objects get, we have ID. So in this one, we're not actually passing through the slug like the item detail view, because of the item detail view, we're passing through slug. This one, we're passing through the ID. So it's, I think it's a UUID. Let me have a look. Invoice line. It might just be ID. In a production environment, you'd probably use a UUID, but this is just an ID. No dramas, okay? So we're passing through ID. So they are the basic class-based views that we're using. Let's come back to, let me minimize these a little bit so it's easier on the eye. There we go. Let's minimize that. We've got more on the screen. There we go. How's that? So we're using a couple of decorators here. So all of them login required. So you can't make a request to these views unless you're logged in. Everything in the e-commerce is locked for authenticated users. That's a lie, actually. The items view, is that right? No, it's not. So everything in e-commerce, you must be an authenticated user. This is not an open access shop. This is for subscribed users only. Okay, you could make it for those that are unauthenticated, but the user story would be different, right? So if they filled up their cart, it'd be linked to their session rather than their database entry. And then when they come to pay in the checkout, it would be create an account. Or you could just use the session key and the data from the user. There's ways of doing it. I've done it before, but it's a little bit easier in terms of a course to link it to a definitive line in the database. So add or remove item. We're using this function to handle the adding and removing of items to a cart. This is also where we handle stock. Okay, so this is a method, this is a view that we can call. Remember, a view can be anything. We handle a request and we give a response. The response can be anything, right? The request can be anything. So we make a call from jQuery. So an Ajax call to add or remove item, and we add an item to a user's cart, or we remove an item from a user's cart. And when doing that, we manage the stock level as well. So if you remember when we were creating the models in module 10, one of the things that was important was to differentiate between items on a store shelf and items in a cart, because the stock level, the itinerary, let's say you have 10 items on a store shelf, when one is removed and goes into a cart, the itinerary stock drops by 1. But it doesn't disappear, it's just it lives in a cart until it's either paid for or removed from the cart. Okay, so that's the add and remove functionality. So when we add, we remove stock by 1, or however many we're putting in the cart. If we remove, we add stock back onto the item model. Hope that makes sense. So we start off with a data dictionary with some basic kind of key values. So we've got result, error, message, something went wrong, redirect, false. That's kind of, you'll see what we're doing with that when we're working with JavaScript. Try and accept. So we get the object ID, key error or value error. So we've got an invalid request. So these kind of sort of catch. So we try to get the object ID. If it doesn't get posted, then we have basically an invalid request. We must have an object ID. The object ID is the item ID. So if we don't send one through, you get an invalid request. If we don't get an action, the action will be add or remove. If that's not posted through, invalid request. Okay, so we're just trying to catch all of these problems. So this is the validation, if you like. Try and accept. So if we get the object ID, so if we've got this far, we know that we've got an object ID and we've got an action. So we then try to get the item from the object ID. Now, if we can't from the ID, the item doesn't exist, then we post object does not exist. So this is validation. If we get this far, we know we're good to go. We have an item in a database, and we've got the user from the request. Okay. Get the quantity. So request.post.get. So we're getting the quantity that's posted. So if there is no object quantity, then it defaults to 0. Okay, so quantity, we changed it the 0. If it's a string, we change it always to an integer. That's what we're doing there. Stock is the item stock currently. We then get the cart item from the user, request.user. So this is now the user cart. Remember, if we've never made a call before, it will create the cart. It won't get the required cart, sorry. We then instantiate the e-commerce manager. Now you could do this. For me, that's surplus to requirement. No, that's a lie. Right, so I'm reading that wrong. Right, so this is cart item. This is not the cart. So what we're doing, we're creating a cart item. That's nothing to do with a user's cart. This is an item that is associated to the item. So this is a cart item associated to the item. So it links the two and it adds a user and an item. So that cart item is specific to the user and the item. Okay. We then instantiate e-commerce manager, and we create a cart for the user, or we get a cart for the user. Then we do a match case. So this is why we need Python 10, right? So this only got released in Python 10. So we're matching the action. So the action is either add or remove. And we've got case 1 is remove. So if we're removing an item, then we go through this code. So there's a method in the cart model called add or remove. Where are we? Add or remove. There you go. So that's the method we're calling. So we either add or remove. If we're removing, it's self.items.remove object. If we're adding, then we do this. Okay, so that's what we're doing there. So adding or removing the item to the database. Quantity, stock. So the new stock is the stock that we had plus the quantity. Because we're removing, we're adding the stock back. Okay, and then we save the new stock. And we change the quantity and save. Okay, and then lastly we have add, which is if there's not enough stock, then we return. So that's the first check we do. So if we're adding something, the stock goes to 0. So if the stock's 3 and we want to add 4, it says no, there's not enough stock. So there must be enough stock for this to work. This is quite a handy little function to have. Again, we're using JSON response. Data, quantity. So get the quantity of the cart item. We change the database by adding or removing. We're posting through the action of add. The stock, because we're adding into our cart, we're removing it from stock, so we minus. So these are the opposite. So one of them is we're adding, one of them we're removing. Then we save the cart. Okay. We get the item count, the item total price, and the item stock. We just get them as variables so that we can post them through to the data dictionary. So we've got the result is success, message, which is kind of an F string, redirect false, and then we've got a data dictionary. Now, doesn't make much sense because we haven't done the jQuery yet. So we'll be taking this data in the jQuery and posting a message in another module. Okay, so essentially what you really need to understand from this view is it's just a view that handles the function of taking an item from the shelf and putting it in your cart, removing it from your cart and putting it back onto the shelf. Okay, you must use Ajax to use it. You must give an object ID, you must give an action, and there must be stock enough to cover the quantity that you want. Okay, so that's what it's doing. So it's an integral part of this application actually. Then got another one called update source. Let's look at this one quickly. So we receive the card ID from jQuery. So we're using jQuery to make a call to this. That's why we've got Ajax required. We get the card ID, we instantiate the e-commerce manager, and then we call it put source. So all of that method is doing is taking a Stripe ID and it's updating that source in Stripe to say this card is now default. That's all that's doing, okay? But we update source whenever we add a card and it becomes default in Stripe and in turn becomes default in our database. And lastly, this is kind of the biggie, if you like. Doesn't look much because most of the hard work is being done in the manager, okay? So Ajax required, so we'll be making a call using Ajax, jQuery. We create a little dictionary here called data. So if all goes wrong, we pass data through to a JSON response and it says error, something went wrong, right? Okay, you can be more detailed than that, but that will do for now. We get the token from Stripe, from the jQuery call. Okay, so we get Stripe token. If there isn't one, we get none, okay? We only get token from Stripe if it's a new card. So Stripe will create an encrypted token that we use to post that card via jQuery. And we get that token and say, right, this is a new card, so we need to handle it in a certain way. However, if we're using a card ID, we use the card ID instead. So it won't be both. It'll either be a token or a card ID. And from the ID or the token, we then process it in a certain way, right? So we've got token, source ID. If we can't find it, it's none. So one or the other is, one is true, one is false. One's none, one's not. Okay, and then what we do, we instantiate e-commerce manager, post the user, and we post token, we post source ID. Now in the manager, we're handling this. So we're instantiating the e-commerce manager with the token and source ID. Invoice, we post invoice. Okay, this is where we call the util post invoice. We're now calling this, okay? Okay, so if there is a token, what we do is we post, so we create a card, Stripe's side, and then we get the source ID. So we've now got a new source ID, okay? Self.source ID becomes source ID. Hope that makes sense. And then if the status from invoice is 200, these are our accepted responses. If it's not in the 200 region, then it's basically an error. So we post redirect home with a result success, and the message is what we get from Stripe. If it's a 400 or 500 or something like that, we just post a message and we post back a JSON response. Okay, that is it for views. Actually, it looks like we don't need Stripe there, but don't worry about that. So we've got a load of generic views and we've got some new Ajax function views that we're going to look at. We now need to create the URLs. So in e-commerce, create a new file called urls.py. Go back into here, which is GitHub. Get to the bottom. There's a lot going on. Like always, we need to adjust our views to make sure that when we check our URLs. In this case, we need to create a new file called URLs in e-commerce. Create a file and use the following code. We already created the file. So no different here to cause and URL users. App name is e-commerce, whereas the others are called something different. And then we have some e-commerce specific URLs. So you can see here that we've got items, item. So let's look at this one first. So this is our URL for items. So it's items / is the URL. So it's localhost 8000 / items will be the URL for displaying our shop items. Now, if we're looking at a specific item, so it would be the item view, it's item, so it's no longer with the S, so you drop the S, and then we have slug. So there's a slug field in the model, okay? So we're using Django extensions, we've got a slug field, and in the model as well, at the very top here, whereas item, we've got the get absolute URL. So the absolute URL for that specific item in the database would be item / slug, okay? That's how it all links together. That's how the view, the detail view, gets the specific item when a user visits the URL, okay, using the slug. Okay, so it's regular expression, it's kind of a slug, and then we've got items, add or remove. So this is the URL that we'll be using and calling from jQuery to add or remove items into our cart. Okay, so this is calling the add or remove items. It's called add or remove with underscores. Then we've got a checkout view, pay view. So to pay, we'll be calling Stripe payment. So this isn't a view that returns a HTTP response. This is just an Ajax view that we call, get the JSON response, and then return a message. Cart view, orders. Then we've got order, which is a detail view. And remember, we're not using slug in this one, we're using ID. So in views, there we go, we've got the get object here. We're looking for the ID from Quarks. So this is the ID that's been passed through to the URL. And then update source. So that's the update source, that's the other Ajax view. So these are all of our views, okay? They link nicely with it. So these are all of our URLs that link nicely with our views, okay? So we've now got views, URLs. We now need to wire this up to the URL conf, which we always do, right? So we go into Django course, go into URLs. We now need another line here. I like to have them in alphabetical order. This will be e-commerce with an E. E-commerce. Now we look in instructions. It should say, there we go. Now there we go. Now register the e-commerce app with Django course underscore URLs. And you can see there I've added e-commerce. Happy days. That is it. Okay, that is it. This should now allow us to visit some URLs, albeit we haven't wired up the templates yet. So we're going to have problems. We tried to do it. We're going to have problems because we haven't got the e-commerce stuff wired into the navigation bar. It just probably won't work at this point in time. So the next module, module 13, we'll start wiring up templates and static files. Okay, so this is when it starts getting good. This is when all of the work from module 10, 11, and 12 start actually yielding results. So please like this video, add a comment. I like the feedback. Let me know if there's anything else you want to see. And also subscribe to the channel. But in the meantime, I look forward to starting module 13 and I hope you join me. See you later. Bye-bye.